from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Brad White and Bob Weber will talk about the heritability of reproductive traits in the beef cow herd, how that factors into herd genetic selection, and they'll also offer a checklist of preparations for calf weaning this fall. Also today, from the Weather Data Library at K-State, Chip Redmond will talk about some of the new weather features for you agricultural producers that are now available on K-State's Mesonet website. He's been talking those up at K-State Field Days recently. And K-State's Charlie Lee takes a look at the just-announced changes to the implementation of the Endangered Species Act. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today, our Tuesday edition, and thanks for listening in. We'll begin with a conversation for the benefit of you cow-calf producers. As you consistently work hard to advance the genetic makeup of your herds, the heritability of favorable genetic traits becomes highly important, and that can be a fairly elusive thing. But it is worthy of discussion, according to the two participants in the latest Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. They take that up and slip in a word about preparing for calf weaning this fall. Veterinarian Brad White and cow-calf specialist Bob Weber are at the microphones.
The heritability of reproduction, this comes up frequently, and a lot of times I'll give a talk and talk about reproduction, and I'll say, well, how heritable is it?
I think it varies a lot depending on how you define the trait. And we know cow reproduction, and for that matter, male reproduction or male fitness are affected by both genetics and environment. And our traditional view is that reproductive traits on the cow side are lowly heritable, which means that environmental influence is huge. The interesting thing, though, is if you go through the literature and you can sort of think of these practical examples of situations where if the nutrient environment is pretty lush and you experience a low amount of reproductive failure, you don't have very much data to work with to start with because all the cows made successful records. They had a calf, right? We would say variation in genetics has a low impact. If you go to sort of a middle of the road or harsher environment where you do see some reproductive failure, it can be a function of either we didn't manage our 2-year-old cows right in terms of nutrition, or something underlying in terms of genetic potential. They might be too big in terms of mature size, or lactation potential doesn't fit the production environment, something like that. And so we see variation and then we go, it's heritable. So I think a lot has to do with the estimates we get is dependent a lot on both how many environments we sample, how big the populations are, and how extreme or how different those contemporary groups might be in terms of
But you bring up a good point in that we often when I get the question, how heritable is reproduction, I say relatively low. It's not like a musculoskeletal trait. But when you were just giving your explanation, you talked about the musculoskeletal trait of frame size, which is highly heritable, being tied into, because it directly affects reproduction, especially if my nutrition varies.
Yeah, I think one of the complexities of reproduction is it's, if we think about did she calve or not, it's a binary outcome, but it's affected by lots and lots of things. So it's a really complicated trait, whereas if we think about growth to some defined endpoint, that's a lot more transparent. Right?
It's affected by nutrition.
Yeah, nutrition.
And then we can control a lot of that if we look at a feed yard environment.
Yeah, if we take, say, mature weight or mature height, heritability estimates typically 0.6s or 0.7s. Okay, so it's really easy to influence. When you throw those out, 0, not heritable, 1, complete absolute heritability. Yeah, I think coat color.
Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. So you're saying musculoskeletal, some of those things, 0.6?
Yeah, so the mature weight, mature height ones are on the far end of high heritabilities. If we think about weaning weight or yearling weight, typically 0.2 to 0.4, depending on the breed and you know how that's modeled. So, and when we say that, we mean 20 to 40% of the variation we observe amongst individuals is due to genetics, and then 1 minus that is the fraction that's due to environment. Yeah,
so weaning weight, you said 0.2, so 20% there and 80% other stuff.
Yep.
So what about our reproductive traits? Do you have numbers for those?
Yeah. So if we think about some of the measurements that we talk about in the industry today, things like heifer pregnancy, for example, would be in the upper teens, low 20s, depending on breed. Cow stayability, so that's the length of it's stayability traditionally defined is, did she have a calf at 6 years of age, given she had a calf at 2? So, back in the early 90s, it was put forth that, cow's break-even point in terms of her profitability is about age 6. And so that seemed like a logical spot to measure, did she make it to 6 or not? Or made a calf record, so calf weaning weight at 6, given she had a calf at 2. And that heritability is somewhere in the typically low 0.2s. So not particularly high, but not zero either. Other measures have been put forth that have differing heritability. So we can think about, measurements like ovulation rate, postpartum interval, so how long between calves, calving interval is another idea that's been put forward. The challenge, I think, with a lot of those is sort of defining the contemporary group. So understanding, that cows are in a common parity. So as we collect data, we have to be pretty careful about how we kind of analyze that. And that makes it a little complicated because we can think about, all of the cows that were put into production, calved, bred as yearlings in a common contemporary group, calved as 2-year-olds, then 3-year-olds, and then 4-year-olds. And we collect data as we go along to try and inform.
It's hard to get enough data from the peer groups. So
Yep.
if you boiled it down to a couple numbers that you wanted to look at, so we talked about stayability, but if we wanted to look at reproduction, what would be some of the numbers you look at, and maybe do some of those have higher heritability than stayability?
Yeah, so I think one of the ones that's sort of evolved relatively recently is sort of the idea of stayability, but looking at it in shorter time intervals. So did she calve at 3 given 2? Did she calve at 4 given 3? And so we get information early in a cow's life, because one of the challenges with stayability is that by the time a sire gets proven for stayability, well, it's 6 years before the cow makes a record, right? So you had 2 more years between when that bull went into service and his first daughter's calved. So he's at least 8. He's probably more like 9 or 10 by the time he's proven. Well,
and then there are other traits that have already progressed.
Yeah, we're way past this bull. Yeah. We're a generation or 2 on to the next bulls. And so the time factor really plays a role in these in terms of data analysis. So some other things that are coming along, so this idea of changing stayability to capture data early on, because we know, if a cow fails as a 2-year-old and we color, she's not going to make a record at 6. We got all the information out of that cow we're going to get. So using that earlier parity data makes sense. I'm working on preparing for a talk this weekend, actually, on cow reproduction, and had a really good conversation with Warren Snelling. He's a scientist at the Meat Animal Research Center. Warren and his colleagues have actually looked at some alternative measurements of reproductive expression. 2 of them really sort of struck a chord with me because they're really intuitive and they're really simple. One is cumulative calf age at weaning. So if we think about cows that do things that we like in terms of reproductive performance, they calve early in the calving distribution, which means they got bred early in the breeding season, right? They're all things we like. And we know from data analysis perspective that the calves that are heaviest at weaning time were the ones, Brad, that were what?
Born early,
right? So this is great. The other measurement is cumulative pounds of calf weaned, so not adjusted for 205 constant age, which is a reflection of growth genetics, but actually how many pounds did this cow get across the scale as for weaned calves. And again, influenced by if she calves early, right? Yeah. So turns out that the heritabilities for those 2 traits in the Meat Animal Research Center data, so about 20,000 some cows, production records, 0.4.
Wow. Higher than even our weaning weight that we talked about earlier. Right.
Yep. And we've made, if you think about the genetic change, or sometimes hesitate to say progress, but the genetic change we've made in weaning weight over time is pretty substantial. Heritability is in the 0.2s. how much improvement could we make in repro with a trait that's 0.4?
Well, and I think we've seen it because you'll see cow families, cow calves early. She has a heifer. You keep that heifer that was born early in the calving season, she's more likely to stay in the herd. So as we go into fall, one of the things we're going to go to our BCI Cattle Chat checklist on things we want to get ready prior to the time that we wean the calves.
Well, I think with some of the market volatility recently, number 8 certainly has to be your marketing plan. So make some plans, figure out what timeline you're working against.
Absolutely. Number 7 is check your fences. And that could be if we're weaning in a pen or if we're going to wean in the pasture, make sure my electric fence is working.
Number 6, a little bit of a nutrition plan if you're thinking about doing some either preconditioning, so kind of getting calves bunk broke pre-weaning, or doing a little kind of backgrounding exercise post-weaning. Spend some time to sort out kind of what you've got available in terms of nutrient resources and what you might need to source in.
Number 5 follows the nutritional plan in that I need to order the feed, whatever I'm going to get, so that I've got it on hand. And I may want to start a little bit of that with the calves beforehand to get them used to it.
Yep, great. Number 4, sit down and have a conversation with your vet, kind of work through your plan. Just make sure you haven't missed something. Get your vet on board. You may need some scripts or be prepared in case you have some BRD or something like that happen, that you're ready and prepared for appropriate treatment schedules.
Number 3, after I get my plan for processing those calves and ties into both marketing and my health plan, order my vaccines and any other health supplies I might need.
Number 2, check your processing facility. So make sure everything's in shape. You've got all the equipment you need and it's in good repair. So when you process calves, you can do that so it's safe for both the handler and the animals.
Number 1, weaning facilities. And this is beyond just the fence. Think about, where's the water? Do I have the right source of water? Am I going to have enough of it? Do I have the bunks? Are we ready to go? Or do I have all the equipment to feed?
K-State's Brad White and Bob Weber. The Cattle Chat podcast in its entirety can be heard at beefcattleinstitute.org. Again, that's beefcattleinstitute.org. Agriculture Today continues after this. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Welcome back. This is Agriculture Today. As you'll know, as you listen each week to our weather segment with K-State's Mary Knapp, there's a tremendous resource of information here at the university on all matters climate here in the state of Kansas that you agricultural producers should take full advantage of. It's called the Mesonet, and we want to let you know what is the latest on that site and how you can take full advantage of it. For with us now is an assistant meteorologist with the Weather Data Library and Mesonet. He also manages those two services here at K-State. Chip Redmond is back with us. And Chip, since we last visited, you have added a few things to this Mesonet service, haven't you?
Yes, sir. We're just trying to apply to modern technologies and modern needs for weather data in the state. And one of the big things is the inversion monitor. We added that so we can look at the stability of lower atmosphere to help producers to make better decisions on when it's a good time to spray and when it's not a good time to spray. And that basically they don't want to spray into a stable atmosphere when an inversion's in place because it's not going to mix vertically as well as they would like it. So we created a page on there that they can look at the current status of the whole state with each station. We can only do it to 30-foot stations, so it's about 40 of the 60 stations. From there, they can also get the current temperature, and they can get the winds as well at 6 foot. So by putting that together, they can make at least have a guidance tool if it's a good time to spray or not. They can also pull up the history if they go to the chart button. They can look at the past 7 days too. So inversions happen every day. They start in the evening and persist overnight and mix out in the morning. And when you have an idea of when they start and when they end each day for the last 7 days, you get a good picture of what's going to be the pattern for the next few days.
So that could be an exceptional guidance on making those herbicide applications. And that's just an example of the many things on the Mesonet. Need to back up a bit here. You mentioned that for that particular service, there are several sites, but more broadly, you have stations throughout the state beyond that number.
Yes. We have 62 weather stations across the state now that all measure standardized parameters at 6 foot, which is temperature, humidity, solar radiation, wind speed direction, pressure, and we also measure soil temperatures, which is a huge one for people, and obviously precipitation.
So a producer goes onto the site, decides what body of information they want, and they will find a map of the state of Kansas identifying links to click on for those various 60-some sites, and then they can pick and choose what they want to know about, basically.
Correct. On that main page, you get a quick portal of what the current temperatures are, and you can look at the rolling 24-hour precipitation to know how much it rained last night, and you can look at the current winds. And you can get additional details when you select a station of your preference or close proximity. And then through that menu in the top left, those 3 bars, that's how you can access all the tools on there.
Soil temperatures, degree days, soil moisture, inversion, something we've spoken of somewhat recently, the animal comfort index is there too.
Yeah, just a tool that's calculated hourly, and we log that for the last 7 days. We don't have historical data past the last 7 days, but you can look on there what the current cattle comfort indexes are, and you can also look at solar radiation values, wind, temperature, humidity, all those variables that go into that parameter. You can look at them real time to know what demands may be.
And therefore take what precautions you may need if your livestock, for instance, would be under stress from that particular high humidity, high temperature day.
Yeah, we don't do any forecasting either. That's the question we get a lot, is that we focus on the current observations and historical data, and we are the portal for that. If you want forecast data, you have to go somewhere else.
One can dig as deep as one wants to, Chip, into that website. There's something else they can have a look at if they're so inclined. It's called a precipitation probability graph. What's that about?
So if you go to the menu and go to the climate link at the bottom, that'll take you to our climate.ksu.edu page.
Which is somewhat separate, but obviously related.
Yes, this is part of the State Climate Office, which falls under the Weather Data Library umbrella. That includes the State Climate Office and the Mesonet. That provides probability based upon the day of the year and how often precipitation has occurred on the day of certain magnitude, whether a tenth of an inch, I think it goes up to a half an inch for each day. So you can see that obviously in the summertime we have the most likelihood of rainfall just because we have more rain events than in the wintertime we have a less likelihood of rainfall. So you can look at that on a day-by-day basis.
And for obviously multiple locations around
Yes,
the state.
that's for the century stations, so the 100-year-old stations. Mm-hmm. So those are stations where they've taken observations for up to 100 years and at one location. And those are usually manual measurements as well. We have one here on campus at K-State.
But you have many things that producers, whether they be livestock or obviously crop producers, to tap into. And you keep trying to add more to the mix here, Chip. Is there anything on the horizon that you have in your sights right now?
Well, the biggest question we get is with the Mesonet, how many stations are we going to have? Are we adding stations? Where are we growing? We're working on a paper right now about where to find the biggest holes in the Mesonet scientifically. And we identified those locations. And so our plan is to grow in those areas. And so this year we're adding a station in Nemaha and in Norton County by the end of the year. And then we also are going to grow by 2 more stations somewhere in Kansas next year, as well as 4 new stations in the Northwest that's been funded by Emergency Management and Homeland Security. Outside of that, we're working on several different tools that'll help people maybe get some of the data they felt that they haven't been able to access easily previously. So one of those things would be precipitation. People want more information than just a rolling 24-hour precipitation. They want to know how much rain fell since midnight, how much rain fell this week, how much rain fell in the last month. So bringing that data in something we'll be working on in the future.
And just as an FYI for folks, those stations are sophisticated technology. They're fairly involved as you place them around the state, aren't they?
Yeah, they're standardized, scientific, calibrated equipment that is bit more expensive than your backyard weather station. And one of the things that we've really enjoyed with these 2 new stations this year is that we're working with collaborators of co-ops and different ag groups, as well as emergency management, to bring groups together to support these stations in their area, because they see the demand and they see the need for it, whether it's drought monitoring with soil moisture or insurance claims with wind or livestock indemnity program is a huge thing this year for us. We did almost all the claims for the entire state, and by having the wind chill data there is vital.
So you'd take inquiries from any local entity to establish such a station?
Yeah, we take inquiries for anything, whether it's for a station or if you have a data request that you like weather data to back up maybe an insurance claim or compare to different things like that. We do that as well. And we do take inquiries from areas that don't have stations, because obviously we do want to grow. The end goal will be somewhere around a weather station per county. But that's 105 weather stations. We're over halfway there.
Getting closer.
But there's also a lot that goes on behind the scenes. It takes technicians to maintain it. It takes, calibration equipment to test that equipment, and a lot of those kind of things as well as the infrastructure of the servers and whatnot to run. So all that data on 90% of our pages is 5-minute data, which is basically real-time weather data that you can look at and see what the current conditions are. A lot of the other data, say you get data from an airport or you get the co-op data that's used at those Century stations, it could be once an hour or once a day. Mm-hmm. So by having that real-time information, you have better guidance to make better decisions. And it takes a lot of behind the scenes to provide that data real-time.
Yeah, the freshness of the data is really the hallmark of Mesonet, and you continue to want to grow it. So hats off to you and to Mary and your entire team over there for putting this together and continuing to expand it. And if anybody would like to know more about it, it's as simple as checking out the website, right?
Yep, that website is mesonet.ksu.edu. That's mesonet.ksu.edu. And, we always love to hear from the people about feedback. We have more users now than we've ever had, and we can see that with our statistics. So people are obviously taking an interest in it and utilizing it. That's great. Give us some feedback. You have comments, questions, you can get our contact information off the website, and we're open to anything.
Chip, not only can folks go conventionally online to the website, but they can use their mobile device to access the information likewise, right?
Yes, sir. You have to go to that website once. You go to it, you bookmark it, and you can bookmark this on both Apple and Android phones, and then you add it as an icon to your home screen, and it behaves as an app. And so every time you hit that icon on your home screen, it'll take you straight to the website, and it'll be a fast track for you.
Can't overstate how exceptional this tool has become over the recent years. Chip, once more, hats off to you and your folk for accomplishing so much with it, and looking forward to the next iteration of it, whatever it might be. Appreciate you coming by.
Thank you.
That's Chip Redmond. He's an assistant meteorologist at K-State and the manager of the Weather Data Library and the Mesonet service out of the university, mesonet.ksu.edu. If you have yet to visit that, by all means, producers and anybody else with any interest in weather and climate, take advantage of that. This is Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you, turning to today's agricultural news headlines for you now, and the latest crop progress and condition report for Kansas from the USDA. And for the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies in Kansas 13% surplus, 70% adequate, 17% short to very short. The subsoil moisture at 9% surplus, 73% adequate, 18% short to very short. The condition of the corn crop, 51% good to excellent, 33% fair, 16% poor to very poor. Corn in the dough stage now at 84%, in the dent at 51%, and corn mature at 7%. Soybean crop condition, 53% good to excellent, 35% fair, 12% poor to very poor. Soybeans blooming now at 90%, and beans setting pods at 73%. A few dropping leaves, 1% of the crop in that state. Grain sorghum condition, 63% good to excellent, 27% fair, and 10% poor to very poor. Sorghum headed 81%, and sorghum coloring now at 23% in Kansas. As for the condition of the corn and soybean crops nationally, we turn now to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says corn condition improved slightly from last week.
We're now at 57% good to excellent, up a point, 13% very poor to poor, that number down a point, and it was still, though, running a bit behind last year's condition. We were looking at 68% good to excellent and 12% very poor to poor a year ago.
He says at least a quarter of the corn crop is rated very poor to poor in several states,
including Indiana and Ohio, as well as North Carolina in the southeast. So some trouble spots, certainly, with the corn.
He points to severe delays in crop development.
Corn dented, also far behind schedule. Just over a quarter, 27% of the corn dented by the 25th of August. That's barely half of the 5-year average of 46% and less than half of last year's 59%.
Soybean conditions.
Inching upward for the week ending August 25th, now 55% good to excellent, 13% very poor to poor. A week ago, those numbers were 53%. And 14% respectively.
He says this is below last year's condition report at this time.
We had about two-thirds of the crop, 66% rated good to excellent this time in 2018, and just 11% very poor to poor.
He says at least a quarter of the soybeans are rated very poor to poor in Ohio and Indiana. He says 94% of the nation's soybeans are blooming compared to 100% last year.
Soybean setting pods finally coming along. We're almost to the 4/5 mark, 79% setting pods by August 25th. 5-year average 91%, last year at this time 94%.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Handing it on over now to K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook for this week's edition of Milk Lines. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers about controlling feed costs as we go through the next 12 to 18 months. Looks like we'll likely continue with some fairly tight milk margins for the next year, maybe year and a half. So as we begin to start planning for the next 12 months to 18 months, and as we're looking at feed, I think we need to pay careful attention to inventory control. As we know, feed is about 50% of our total cost of production, so anything we can do to lessen these expenses is generally in our favor as long as it does not negatively impact milk production. So what are some of the things that I think are important to think about? Number one, I think it's really important to think about how much inventory do we actually have to have on hand. One of the costly inventories that we carry on all of our dairy farms are forages. A lot of times our grains or other supplements that we feed, we buy on a monthly or maybe even more often than that. However, forages we tend to buy in the fall and maybe even during the summer if we're talking about something like alfalfa hay. And we tend to store it on our farm for many months and sometimes even over a year. So as we look at trying to control cost in the next 12 to 18 months, practicing careful forage control in terms of the inventory becomes very, very important. So I want to encourage you to really consider how much silage you need to chop and store this year. Do you have some corn acres that could be converted from silage to grain harvest? In other words, if we have excess acres available for silage, more than what we will need to carry us for the next 14 to 16 months following chopping, could be harvested as grain. This could reduce our overall grain bill on our dairy and reduce the amount of outside income we need to pay for feed, because we've already probably paid those production costs for those silage acres. For those of you that purchase corn silage, I know a lot of times we try to buy several months excess corn silage every year. This may be one of those years where you continue to try to manage your forage inventory to a point that you actually, at the end of the chopping season, you only have 14 to 16 months of corn silage on the ground. The reason for that is, again, we're trying to reduce the amount of cash outlay we have in the next year or so. So managing our inventory of corn silage could be a major factor in how our overall cash flow looks like. How about if you're going to be short on corn silage? Can you actually short yourself on corn silage and use something else to fill in? Well, it could be possible. And we'd have the opportunity to raise some triticale or maybe even some rye over the winter, chop it in the spring of 2020, then use that to fill in for some of the corn silage inventory we would normally chop and pay for in the fall. Some other things to think about: you probably have some other silages on the farm, alfalfa silage, or maybe even small grain silage. Some of those could be replaced by some wet byproducts if needed for a few months, or even dry hay. Again, carefully figure out what you have, working with your nutritionist to determine what you actually need to get through until the next harvest season. And for things like alfalfa hay and alfalfa silage, that's usually about an 8-month inventory that we need to carry on the farm over winter. Really don't probably need any greater than that. Lastly, as you look at your inventory, if you're feeding your own heifers, what kind of forages are you feeding to the heifers? Do some of those forages need to be transferred to the lactating herd, and fill in some other types of forages for those heifers? Heifers can do fairly well on diets that are designed with things like corn stalks, grass hay, maybe some sorghum silage or other small grain silages. They don't necessarily have to be fed corn silage. So if we need to conserve on corn silage, feed that to the lactating cows and feed some cheaper forages to our heifers. Again, that would be a way to manage our cash flow over the next 12 to 18 months. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take careful inventory of forages and determine what's actually needed to make it through the next 12 to 18 months.
Thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
This Agriculture Today concludes with our weekly segment on wildlife management. Aboard once more is wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. Significant news coming out here just a few days back, Charlie, about revisions to the Endangered Species Act. And those will go into effect relatively soon, you say.
Yes, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service released final regulations on August 12th. Those would go into effect 30 days after they had been published in the Federal Register. That document was pretty extensive. It relates to the Endangered Species Act and the formal processes that allow species to be listed. As you recall, the Endangered Species Act, or otherwise known as ESA, is credited with saving lots of species. First one that comes to mind would be the bald eagle, but also the California condor, grizzly bear, gray wolves, and many others. Today it protects more than 1,600 plant and animal species. Actually, 99% of those species that have been placed on the endangered species list have not gone extinct. So it's been an act that's been in place for a considerable number of years, has a pretty broad support, but there's always places for improvement. And the current administration suggested some changes were necessary, and have proposed those changes and actually released those changes after a couple of years of careful study.
And all of those were covered in a sizable document, which we can't pass along in its entirety here today. But you've broken this out into 4 distinct modifications, right?
Well, I think the first one that's important is that it removes the language that requires listing decisions be made without reference to possible economic or other impacts. The Endangered Species Act has had one strong component over the years, and that was all decisions were made on science, not political or economic decisions. This current rule says that's still going to be in place, but they will collect economic information but not use it to form the listing decision. Now, detractors of that provision say, well, that's probably not going to be what happens, that it would not make sense to go ahead and collect all the economic data and then not use it, but that's what the regulations say now. So I think that's an issue that is very controversial, but I think that's one of the important things in these 140 pages of changes. The next would be a list of situations in which critical habitat no longer needs to be designated at the time of listing. So it requires the agencies to first evaluate the occupied habitat before considering unoccupied habitat for designation, and it requires a heightened standard for unoccupied areas to be designated as critical habitat. So I think this would probably reduce the scope, or acres, if you will, or area that these changes will take place on. The third, and another important part that I think most people support, is some changes in the consultation process. Currently, the consultation process requires federal agencies to consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service to make sure that any of those federal actions are not likely to jeopardize the existence of species that are endangered or threatened. And it also establishes an expedited consultation process which will allow a more timely consultation, and it establishes a 60-day deadline. So this should not delay decisions on listing proposals.
And then the fourth, and it is drawing attention as well, and maybe the most discussed of these 4, and that is the threshold for threatened species has been changed here.
Yes, they've changed the blanket 40 rule, which automatically provided threatened species with the same protections from take as endangered species. To extend the same type of proposal to a threatened species as to an endangered species really kind of leads people into belief that the same actions are necessary for threatened as in endangered. I do believe that it's important to take steps early to prevent threatened species from becoming endangered, but with this blanket rule removed, now agencies will have to make a specific 4D rule for each newly listed threatened species if it wishes to protect them from take. Now, that's going to greatly increase the workload from the agencies involved, but I think that is probably something that most people can accept.
So those are the 4 basic provisions of the new regulations, but do these changes serve to advance the cause of the Endangered Species Act, or are there still issues to be considered?
I think there are numerous issues to be considered. I suspect there is a lot of controversy about this. To me, it seems unfortunate that much of the decisions on Endangered Species Act and listing processes end up in court. And we're ending up in court with this one because just last week a group of conservation organizations filed suit to prohibit these regulations from going into effect. It's unfortunate that many of these decisions end up in court when I think they should be made on a scientific basis, but that seems to be what's happening, and I suspect this is not going to do anything to reduce the litigation involving Endangered Species Act. As long as there's litigation, it means there's controversy ongoing. I'm not sure that the constant controversy about Endangered Species Act will ever be resolved. It just seems to be one of those that people on one side of the aisle or the other have very strong views. I think it's done some great things, but I do think there's been room for improvement.
And once more, actions taken now to address the Endangered Species Act changes that were announced August 12th will go into effect in early September. And so we will continue to track this act and its provisions in protecting wildlife. Charlie, we appreciate the word. Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. And that'll do it for today's broadcast. Remember, check out our podcast service at agtoday.net, agtoday.net. Meantime, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.